Do you yearn for travel that involves outdoor adventure and learning? I do. I also have a passion for all things farming and agriculture. I've traveled to exotic jungles to learn about growing chocolate. I even once owned my own organic vegetable and sunflower farm. And now I'm planning my journey back to agriculture. Agritourism, defined as travel that involves some type of agricultural experience. Agritourism is all about entertaining, but the marketing strategist in me knows that at its core, agritourism is really about educating, and education affects change. My future farm needs to deliver a profound experience to all of its visitors. It needs to educate people about food, health, and climate. Join me to learn from experienced agritourism farmers and entrepreneurs and help me build my future farm strategy. And who knows, maybe one day soon you'll find yourself in a tropical jungle cutting open cacao pods with a machete, or savoring an outdoor plant-to-plate community dinner with 100 guests at a farm in Illinois. So let's tap into the agritourist in you. Welcome to the Agritourist Podcast. This is your host, Jen Ross. So I've been doing a lot of local traveling, really digging into the Northeast U.S. where my ag focus seems to be currently taking me. I visited a bean festival at a farm in Sheffield, Massachusetts, located in the southern part of the Berkshires. The Berkshires, or Berkshire County, is located in western Massachusetts, with New York very close to the west, Connecticut to the south, and Vermont to the north. Before going to the festival, I met a friend for lunch at the Berkshire Farm Co-op and explored the downtown area of Great Barrington, Massachusetts. Kind of fell in love with the vibe of the whole area, the energy, the outdoor air, the agriculture focus, everything about it. Of course, I grabbed a few brochures related to farming and local businesses and came across something called Berkshares, a local currency program. Berkshires is the best-known contemporary example of a place-based currency. They have over 300 participating locally owned and community-minded businesses that support Berkshires to keep money circulating in the region, thereby contributing to a greater local multiplier effect. My marketing and business development mind immediately recognized what a brilliant concept this program is. I had the pleasure of speaking with Jared Spears, the marketing director of Berkshires. Berkshires is a program that came out of the Schumacher Center for a New Economics. They work to envision the elements of a just and regenerative global economy, undertake to apply these elements in the Berkshires, and develop the educational programs to share the results more broadly, thus encouraging replication. Stay tuned for an interesting history on how the Berkshires Local Currency Initiative got started and transformed out of some previous programs, including Deli Dollars and Berkshire Farm Preserve Notes. Jared provided me with a good understanding of the local economics that contributed to the launch of this local currency. Enjoy my conversation with Jared Spears.
Hi there.
Hey, Jared. How are you?
I'm well. How are you doing?
Very good. Good to meet you.
Likewise.
So, why don't we just start first with you, who I know, let's just do a brief who you are as far as the organization Berkshires goes, and then I want to get into a little bit about the Berkshires and Berkshires. So you're the marketing director?
That's right, yes.
Okay. Just give me a quick, I know you have a little bio on the website. Tell me just a little bit about you.
Sure. My name is Jared, and I'm originally from outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I moved upstate from New York City about 3 years ago and got involved with a nonprofit organization in the Berkshires called the Schumacher Center for New Economics, which is a small, described as a think and do tank, but basically a community economic development organization that really thinks about the principles of a just regenerative economy from kind of a global perspective, and then brings that thinking down to the local level through certain initiatives that are community-based initiatives that sort of spin off from that thinking and find their own footing in the community. So one example of those initiatives is a local currency called Berkshires. So, as part of my role as director of communications at the Schumacher Center, I took on that responsibility as marketing director of Berkshares 3 years ago, at a really interesting time that we can get into, where the Berkshares program was actually piloting a digital app, which was the first time that it had ever ventured from its basis, which is a community issued paper currency, complementary currency that circulates sort of in parallel to the US dollar. So that's, yeah, where my involvement with Berkshire's has begun and has stayed with that.
Yeah, did the job bring you up to the region, or did you just want to move up there and then
Right.
find an opportunity?
More the former than the latter. So more so was finding the right job at the right time, but living in New York City, um, yeah, vacations upstate were always kind of like one of the things that kept me sane. And
I
so
was
I
just in the
know,
city yesterday, so
yeah,
I used to work there as well, but
I,
it
I
reminds you of
think,
the chaos.
the sort of Brooklyn to upstate pipeline is a real thing. It's not unique to me, I realize, but I definitely fit that mold and had a particular, I think, affinity for, yeah, the rural setting and sort of the immediacy connection to nature.
So when we talk about the Berkshires region, how is that really defined geographically?
Right. So, well, there is Berkshire County, Massachusetts, and then when we think about Berkshares, the nonprofit that issues this currency, it's a little bit broader in terms of, sort of being able to include communities that are on the border. So, the Housatonic River that runs through the Berkshires flows down through Connecticut. And as we do think sort of in terms of a bioregional lens, the sort of state boundaries that we find sometimes feel a little arbitrary to the way that community economics naturally takes hold and works. And so, yeah, we sort of play with that flexibility. But for the most part, Berkshires are a program that operate within Berkshire County, Massachusetts.
Okay. All right. Yeah, because there are people who listen to this internationally and nationally and
Yeah.
don't really understand where we're targeting. So tell me about the start of this program. Like how did this all start? How long ago did it start? I just want to understand some of the
Yeah.
history. I do have a marketing and business development background, and I have been in the farming agricultural world for a while now. And I thought this was brilliant. I really thought it was a brilliant idea. So let me know how it all happened.
Storytelling and history are key to what we do and how we do it. So if you'll permit me, I'll go back and tell you the story. Stories always have multiple beginnings, but one sort of beginning point. So I mentioned the Schumacher Center, which is this nonprofit that's been around for over 40 years. And it has had two co-founders, one of whom has passed away, the other, Susan Witt, executive director, is still sort of running things on the day to day. But her partner, Bob Swan, was a conscientious objector during World War II and a peace activist. So basically refusing to take up arms against his fellow man in the midst of World War II. He served a prison term. Um, with other conscientious objectors who had refused what was then called the religious objection, which was kind of the soft way out. And so kind of hard folks who on principle were refusing to fight. And so that was described later by Bob as kind of like a university type setting where they really took their self-education seriously as prisoners. They sort of dealt with solitary confinement, but as much as they could, they sort of kept their um, like a group mindset as they served that term. And so coming out of that period of intellectual ferment was, yeah, really thinking about the root causes of war and social strife and um, uh, economic injustice. And so came out of that with sort of a threefold idea of how to address those root causes, being um, the the decommodification of land. So I hope that I want to talk to you about Berkshires, but I'm hoping that we kind of bring it full circle because we also have some really interesting land-based initiatives that are designed to support regenerative agriculture in the Berkshires.
Absolutely.
So, but yeah, so those three kind of root causes, the decommodification of land, basically meaning if people and nation states by extension didn't have this kind of proprietary mindset towards how they own land and can transact in land, that would solve a sort of fundamental imbalance in the economic and social life. The second was the ability for communities to issue their own currency. If you go back into the history of the United States and in other countries, sort of pre-industrial or even into the early industrial period, it was very common for local communities to essentially issue their own currency through their banks. It was banks that issued banknotes, and it was only until the U.S. Civil War that the federal government really took the greenback, as it was then called, really became like a predominant currency, and it sort of grew from there, and came to overshadow those local circuits of currency issuance. And then the third was just the rebuilding or, yeah, the reconnecting of ties of community. So if we think about kind of globalization and that whole trajectory, again, this thinking goes back to the 40s, but you can sort of trace the roots of that thinking of if we really think of ourselves as communities first and individuals second, that would solve these kind of fundamental imbalances that lead to economic exploitation and that exacerbate war. So that's the intellectual ground from which all these programs come from. And bringing it back to our local currency initiatives, basically, beginning in the 80s, there was a series of experiments that Bob and others sort of in that rural community who were committed to some of the same principles wanted to just experiment, right, and introduce alternatives and see what was possible. And so that began, first there was a program called Share, which was the self-help program that allowed community members to essentially collateralize small loans to area businesses or small makers who this was in the 80s when there was a huge credit crunch. So it became really difficult for small rural businesses to start up new businesses or to get a loan to, expand their productive capacity, things like that. And so there was a series of loans that were basically collateralized by members of the community, which basically just meant that it gave the local bank the kind of confidence to extend a loan where the individual in question might not have had the credit on paper, so to speak,
Yep.
but members of the community got together through this nonprofit organization, which, was democratic in nature. So they kind of voted on what projects they were going to back. And basically, it was the ability for the community to say, we believe in this person, even if they don't have the credit on paper. And so that was a really interesting experiment in sort of community finance. I think there were 21 loans that were issued through Share. There was one gentleman who harvested trees from like local woodlands, and he wanted to sort of invest in draft horses. And so that was a loan that was enabled through Share. Another was a goat dairy farmer who wanted to invest in, more up-to-date modern milking equipment so that that person could have like a state certified product as opposed to just kind of doing it as a side project on their land. And so those are the types of
Are any
projects.
of those businesses still around today?
That's a great question. I know that the goat dairy farm only recently ceased operation. I think that particular individual who was building out their business in the 80s now just finally retired. So that was a one that for sure had track records. Others, I think, had longer, shorter runs, but yeah, we're going back to 85, 86
Yeah,
now.
just
So
curious, you know?
yeah, but I think yeah, if I the the closing point of that little story is how of those 21 loans, none failed, right? Like all were repaid in full. And so it was sort of a testament to this idea that, a sort of collection of committed community members could come together and create the ability to finance real sort of real economy productive businesses that sort of met all of the social and ecological criteria that folks were looking at. So it sort of proved an alternative theory, so to speak. And from there got into explorations of how to take that to a different level by actually issuing, currency. And so there were examples like Delhi dollars, where there was a local um, Delhi, a guy who, he wanted to finance a move from one location to another. Again, the type of person who at that time couldn't get the bank loan because of what his business and credit looked like on paper, but the community members knew and loved him, and knew that that was the best spot to get their lunch sandwich. So he actually issued vouchers that had kind of like a date that you would be able to redeem it by, which was after the date of the move. So you, as a customer who were supporting Frank at his deli, could walk in with $8 and you'd get a voucher for 10 deli dollars.
That's great.
Right. And what they found through that example and others like it was that not only was it financing that business, but the deli dollars could change hands, right? You might give it to your neighbor or your elderly parent or your friend, and maybe they exchange something, or maybe it was a gift. But so you start to see money circulating within the local community. And so that led ultimately through these little experiments to Berkshires. So Berkshires is as I mentioned, it's a local democratic and place-based organization that issues local currency. Berkshires come in 5 denominations from 1, 5, 10, 20, and 50. And basically they work as cash and are accepted by over 300 businesses in the region. So if you go to, the local food co-op or the farmers market on a Saturday, you'll see the, normal sort of green paper federal dollars changing hands, and you might also catch some bright and colorful bills that look a little bit different because instead of having the faces of presidents, they have representations of local heroes. So people like W.E.B. Du Bois, who was born in Great Barrington, and his face is on the 5 Berkshire note. So it basically just creates like a very different kind of education cultural tool that's bringing attention to these ideas about like what a local sustainable economy really looks like and how that can support people holistically, right? Whereas I think we all know that there's challenges that come from dealing with the global economy, or having the currency issued by the federal government, and sort of the connection between nation states and their ability to wage wars, right? Going back to Bob's kind of initial insight back in World War II, and this alternative vision that basically says communities can empower themselves to do a lot of things in the economic realm, including, sort of issuing their own currency. And what that gives you, thinking about those share program stories, is the ability to kind of pick and support the businesses that kind of uphold community values. So
Excellent.
yeah, that tells you a little bit about it. Thanks for letting me spin out the long version of the story, because I think it's worthwhile.
I know, I think it's very important. Very important. So you have over 300 businesses participating. How
Mhm.
has that evolved over the years as far as numbers and diversity of types of businesses? Like I guess also the second part of that question is I'm just curious how it's received. Like,
Mhm.
you know, um, so on all sides, like,
Yeah,
I could see
I
it,
can
there's a certain thing where I see it being very welcomed, and then, is there pushback? So just go ahead.
for sure. Yeah, I can try to address some of those questions. So I wish I had a more, yeah, like detailed story from 2006 to now in terms of participation. But what I know, sort of coming into the project 3 years ago, there were, yeah, well over 300 businesses that were participating. Most of them for a long time, like a lot of them since the founding of the program. And then, just seeing a lot of small, main streets, small businesses turn over, especially since 2008. I think interestingly, what I noted was that there was right around 2007, 2008, there was a wave of national media interest in Berkshires. And so I imagine that that contributed to, um, a lot of associations and feelings that people have, both good and maybe not so good, where, it kind of had a 15 minutes of fame where, um, like CBS News, for example, or PBS News, like these big national TV outlets coming with their cameras, interviewing people, so, small business owners, and that's obviously very exciting. But then when that sort of wave recedes, then you're sort of left where you started with this initiative that's really based on just a lot of goodwill and community participation, and that isn't offering anybody, um, right? Like it's not the type of program that says, here's the incentive that's gonna, boost your sales or um, have like this crazy marketing exposure beyond that sort of phenomenon that no one really could have anticipated of the national media interest, which I think was frankly just driven by, right, like bigger systemic issues,
Yeah.
things that were going on
Yep.
at that time. So I think that's left the program kind of, yeah, that sort of experience, I suppose, colors the way that people think about and receive Berkshires as a concept now, where it's definitely, there's a lot of goodwill around it and a lot of business owners who understand that um, it's not offering them any sort of panacea in terms of how to keep a small business running, but it also doesn't really cost anything other than a little bit of time and attention. And if you've got an operation where you have multiple cashiers, for example, that you train, there's a little bit of training that you would say is involved. But again, I think in terms of it operating, it feels and looks very much like cash. Businesses have, the Berkshire's program hands out like best practice materials for how to account Berkshire's with your accountant, or how to claim it on your taxes, which that's all above board. So it's just those are the steps that I think it requires of a business to participate. And that's where we see, I suppose, a lot of the effort of like the Berkshires community members who serve on the board and contribute to outreach. It's kind of that constant relationship maintenance and just reminding folks, working out some of those kinks if maybe a business has had a lot of turnover and might, sometimes it falls to the second, third, or fourth priority because of everything that small business owners have to deal with these days,
Excellent.
unfortunately.
Okay. Yeah.
That makes sense?
Yes, it totally makes sense. Now, you have two banks that support the program.
That's right. So it's it really is foundational to have these community bank partners. I mean, um, Berkshire's couldn't necessarily exist the way that it does without them. So how do you get Berkshire's when you live or visit the region? You go to one of these six bank branches. You walk in, you exchange US dollars for Berkshire's on a one-to-one basis, right? But yeah, that's like a really important piece is actually how money services change hands from a regulatory perspective. If you were to try to run a local currency without local banks, you might find that there's a lot of barriers that make that difficult to do unless you have the money of, say, a PayPal or a Visa or MasterCard, because that's basically how the regulatory system is set up, is to look after those kind of big players and make sure that there's nothing, um,
Right.
nothing suspicious happening. Whereas for a small local community, I mean, I can give you a little bit of context. Berkshire's 2006, in the 90s and the early 2000s, there really was a grassroots movement for sort of local currencies and time banks and all sorts of different things that were happening kind of under the surface in the United States. And there's not a lot of local currency initiatives in North America that have had Berkshire's longevity. And that's really what we see as part of that was just the inability for these small, mostly volunteer-based organizations to survive in an environment with so much kind of regulatory scrutiny. Um,
Yeah.
so having the partnerships with the banks is like that's their business, right? Is money services. And so that enables Berkshire's to continue and to thrive and to sort of pursue its broader educational and economic development goals without being burdened, in that way.
Now you said that are there other programs in the, I'll say nationally, that you are aware of or that have come to you for consultation? Because I'm sure.
Certainly, yeah, certainly over the years. And I can say, well, so the Schumacher Center has a local currencies database on its website, and you can log in there and find there
Okay.
are hundreds, if not thousands, of complementary currency initiatives around the world. You find basically on every continent, but Latin America, Europe, East Asia, Africa all have different, like again, like a real plurality of different models and different sort of experiments, especially now that with digital and sort of blockchain, that's created a whole new wave of experimentation as well in local place-based currencies. But in North America, there's the Calgary dollar, which is another kind of long-standing one in Canada, and also not so far from the Berkshires in Kingston, New York, is
Oh,
based out of Kingston, is the Hudson Valley Current. The Current is another really interesting example. They have as well sort of brightly colored paper notes, but it's a mutual credit system as opposed to like a pure currency. So mutual credit, it works very differently. Basically, you're signing on um, as a participating member, and you get issued credit through this sort of allocation system that's backed by the productive capacity of the community. So um, I think it's fascinating, and yeah, that model is worth folks' attention as well. But again, I can really only speak to how Berkshire's has worked and succeeded, and sort of the interoperability with the US dollar, the fact that you can exchange uh, dollars for Berkshire's, I know is what keeps, especially a larger business that doesn't always have the ability to recirculate Berkshire's the way that it needs to for the program to thrive, like having that kind of optionality to say, okay, well, I've got to pay this bill and it's got to be paid in US dollars. So I'm going to take some Berkshires to the bank and get some US dollars back for it. That gives business owners a lot of confidence knowing that they have that ability.
that's great.
Yeah.
That's really fantastic. And I'll look into um,
The
that
Hudson
other,
Valley
yeah,
Current.
that sounds, that sounds different. I want to definitely, I have never heard of that. Um, So what are the plans going forward? So you're the marketing director, marketing strategist. So what do you look at as some future plans for this program, for growing this program, expanding it? What are your focuses right now?
hmm Well, yeah, I would say I would name two. So one is this ongoing conversation that we've had with the as I mentioned, there's the community-based board representatives from the area. And one of the committees is an outreach committee. So that's where we ask these questions most frequently. And we've identified this real sort of challenge and opportunity that the community faces around credit card and debit card processing. Like this might resonate with you depending on, I don't know what it looks like in your community, but I think in many communities around the United States, you increasingly notice small business owners, either sort of charging more if they have to use a credit or debit card, or asking, putting out a sign that sort of asks their patrons to pay in cash when and where they can. And so for Berkshire's, this, yeah, creates an interesting, what we think of as kind of an educational opportunity, just to bring attention to this issue, that the fees that some of these card issuers charge just for, right, like the privilege of transacting your payment, can be burdensome on small business owners. One of our board members is ran the bakery in town, and he said that the annual expenditures for that like went up into 5 digits, right? So you're really thinking about like an actual piece of your pie as a small business that just goes to the Visas and MasterCards, and
Yeah.
even the PayPals and Apples of the world. So I think that's like a kind of near term challenge and opportunity for Berkshire's, just to kind of step into and have a role that says, not only is there a way to pay that doesn't cost anything for these businesses, but it's actually a net benefit for keeping wealth moving within our local community, right? Because the whole idea of the program is that we're recirculating wealth locally. It's not leaving the region, because only these 300 plus businesses who you know and love
Yeah.
are the ones using it. So it's sort of a reason, I think, for folks who aren't in the habit of, when they go into the bank, or, because that's a whole thing now, is people don't routinely go into the bank. So kind of making the excuse to drop in at the bank and get some local dollars and support your local businesses that way.
Okay.
And then looking further out, I did mention, and we can talk more, but yeah, so in 2022, Berkshire's had this pilot program where they introduced a digital app,
Yes.
a
Yeah. That's
scan to pay mobile app version of Berkshire's local currency. So again, still that, one-to-one value with the US dollar, still not, costing anything for businesses to accept that and recirculate those digital tokens. So basically, it just expanded the Berkshire's program into the digital realm. I think around the peak of the app, there was maybe something like 30 or 32,000 digital Berkshires that were kind of out in circulation in the community. So I think, yeah, maybe about a quarter of that total number of businesses that were kind of experimenting with Berkshires at that time. Just to, yeah, again, sort of see how it would work, see what the challenges and opportunities would be from a business perspective for integrating a digital app. And yeah, I think from the organization's perspective, it sort of proved that you can do this thing. You can have digital currency that supports main streets. It can, build adoption. And so from that pilot experience, it's definitely something that Berkshire's is interested in for the long-term future. I mean, we talk a lot about cash and the sort of nice parts of a cash economy that tend to have been sort of forgotten about or undervalued in the last decade or so. But at the same time, I think we see, a future for both, right? Where the convenience of the mobile payment, you can have your kind of homegrown version of Venmo that's keeping the wealth in the community, as opposed to it kind of seeping out. And that hopefully there's, still also the room for the beautiful tactile experience of this local currency that, a lot of love went into its design.
absolutely. Absolutely. That's great. So yeah. So you did this pilot, and I guess you're trying to figure out a way to actually implement this.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's just a lot that goes into, because the paper program, um, it's a little bit of an oversimplification, but you might say like you design it once and it's done. I mean, the paper notes that were created in
Yeah.
2006, you can still have those paper notes circulating. The system is more or less intact and unchanged, although there's kind of exchange rates and little things that have fluctuated in the background. But with an app, it's much different, right? You have to develop the user experience. Um, And there's kind of always iteration, I think, that
Yeah.
happens when you're evaluating like the tech stack and how to deliver a good product for the sort of right amount of investment to deliver the value to the users. And so I think from that perspective, it kind of was just like, let's um, let's do this trial run, kind of prove the theory that it works and gain that kind of insight into what we might want to do differently. And so those conversations are still ongoing in terms of how, like what types of technology, for example, the app beta was based on a blockchain technology. And the thinking that came out of that experience is actually that, yeah, blockchain is sort of designed for scenarios. I mean, sorry if this is outside of you or your listeners' kind of interest, but we're a bit of blockchain nerds. And, it's like the technology there is basically designed for global exchange where trust doesn't exist. And so there's a lot on how that technology works. And, they get into verification and all these things that we feel like the Berkshires doesn't need because we're actually a community that's based on trust. The whole idea is that, everybody knows everybody who's participating. And so maybe blockchain is too much technology, so to speak, for these kind of more local place-based initiatives
Right.
where, can we partner with banks and just do something that uses digital technology, but without all those extra bells and whistles.
Okay. So to summarize this, what are the few ingredients that you feel are making this successful where in the Berkshires? Like, what is it? Because I'm sure if someone was to try, or people have tried to implement this in other places, it may not have gone and endured
Mhm.
the way your program has. What do you think are some of the key ingredients that have made it so successful and impactful?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, there are folks in the community who would say that there's just something about the Berkshires, and that, if you've spent time there, maybe you feel the same way, that as a rural community that, it's part of the state of Massachusetts, but it's the part that feels the most kind of unseen or maybe unrepresented, right, by like what goes on at the state level. So kind of just a self idea of self-reliance, community self-reliance that maybe has a long-standing cultural tradition there that business owners, for example, are it just feels very natural to cooperate in these ways or help each other out. And so the idea of having their own local currency doesn't seem like a stretch. Um, I suppose, as I already mentioned, just in terms of the looking at the US environment compared to some of these other nations where local currency movements are flourishing, you could, then kind of say, well, what is it about the way that these systems are regulated in the United States that is holding back like a sort of natural grassroots impulse for local finance and currency? But yeah, I think overall we just kind of see that again, that if you think of the community as a kind of organism, it has this long history of being able to do things like issuing its own currency that goes a lot further back than all of our modern institutions. And so I suppose we sort of take a long view that way and assume that that impulse will just continually come back to the surface and find new ways to express itself. And it is just, yeah, a good thing. I think that Berkshares was designed in such a way that it has that longevity.
Yeah, excellent. I have one quick question on this topic, and then I just want to get back to some of the other stuff that
Yeah.
you had mentioned for your center. There's a book that I noticed on the website, Follow the Money, Stories from a Local Economy. Just give me what is that? What is that? I'll stop there.
Yeah. So part of the storytelling around Berkshires that began maybe 7 years ago, somewhere around there, like 2015, 2016. A business of the month, basically a profile series where a Schumacher staff member would go and just interview a participating business, sort of get their story as individuals, and kind of bring that into this broader narrative, about like how we want to support that kind of local ingenuity and enterprising spirit. And so over the years, it was, yeah, just collected into a really interesting sort of cross section, right, of who are these folks who take an entrepreneurial initiative in a local rural area, and what does that look like? And so, farmers, woodcutters, driveway pavers, limo services, food co-ops, restaurateurs. It's kind of all there. Everything that makes up like a local rural economy is represented by those profiles that span, more than 5 years at that point that it was published. And that series is ongoing, but at that point in time, it was like we have all these beautiful stories, these beautiful portraits. So let's produce a physical artifact that can help again introduce folks to the program who maybe moved here or haven't been familiar with it.
Excellent. Yeah, I want to look into that. So tell me more about the Schumacher Center and everything, these other initiatives going on. I'd love to know more.
Yeah, as promised. So I think, well, the one other initiative that I want to highlight, because the orientation of your podcast and permaculture or agriculture is the community land trust work that also happens in the Berkshires. So I mentioned that Berkshares, the local currency, sort of came out of the thinking around the Schumacher Center. And another example of such an organization is the Berkshire Community Land Trust. So going back
Okay.
to that idea, right? If we're thinking about rebuilding community ties, community issued currency, and the third piece is decommodifying land. So the Community Land Trust is a really interesting institution that basically gives a nonprofit entity that, again, is democratic and has community representation, the ability to hold land while giving the users, like the occupants of that land, a long-term inheritable lease. So basically, in a nutshell, what that does, it separates how we typically think of like a universal property right to a piece of land. It separates the kind of ground from the buildings and improvements. So if you're a farmer, you can imagine, there's a house on the site, there's a barn on the site, there's fences, maybe there's soil improvements that created through your labor, and so you or your business kind of has an equity stake in all of those things. Whereas the ground beneath you, so to speak, is owned by your community. So that's like the model that, from the Schumacher Center perspective, we feel like that is the natural model. If you kind of look, you have to really go back, but think about the indigenous or sort of modern, pre-industrial ways of land holding, which is really land as a commons, so in trusteeship on a community basis. And what that enables is communities to create or identify the priorities of what types of land use they want to support in their community, and create an initiative so that they can secure land for those purposes. So in the Berkshires, where farm to table and organic farming is very much valued and prioritized, community land access is a way for those local farmers that are using, good ecological practices that might not otherwise be able to afford the cost of land. It's a way to enable that. The other thing that it does is sort of creates a scenario where you can ultimately move away from the speculative value of land, right? Thinking about how expensive land is in places like the Berkshires, it's probably not very different on Long Island, out where you are, where you kind of, right, you might see like a small house that looks pretty run down, And if you go and it's for sale and you realize that it's, I don't know, $750,000, and you're like, what's going on here? Right. But so that's the speculative value that's in the land, as opposed to what's in those buildings and improvements. And the theory again behind the community land trust is that that land value is the result of the effort of the whole community to make that a desirable place, right, to live or to work.
Yep.
And so that value is best held by the community, and decisions about land access and who gets to use it can be managed in this democratic way. So that's the really like quietly transformative potential of some of these models. But what it's doing in the near term, like I mentioned, the Berkshire Community Land Trust has this Farmsteads for Farmers initiative. So that's like a new initiative that builds on a model that was established at the basically right around the end of the 90s, where a farm was the farmer died sort of unexpectedly earlier, early in her life, and um, there was she was a CSA farmer who had a very loyal following and used these sound ecological practices. And it was worried that the farm would be sold, right, to somebody who was going to develop a second home or something along those lines. So the community got together around the Berkshire Community Land Trust and said, how can we make sure that this farm stays like a working farm that serves our community? And it worked out that that model was going to meet those needs and empower some of the younger farmhands who had helped this farmer previously to take over the operation and make a
Wow,
go of it, right? And
that's great.
um, they wouldn't have been able to raise the money to buy buildings, improvements, and land value. And so through this alternative model, the Berkshire Community Land Trust can now raise those funds and have them be tax deductible. So that sort of opens different possibilities, right? So someone can make a tax deductible donation for the community land trust to purchase the land on behalf of the community. And so that's what it's doing now. This Farmsteads for Farmers initiative. There's a farm called River Run, which is 90 some acres, and it's being used as a regenerative pasturage farm, so chickens and lambs. Um, and the Farmsteads for Farmers campaign is in the midst, actually now, basically in the final stretch of a campaign to raise donations to do just that, to basically replicate that first model that I mentioned, Indian Line Farm, and to kind of show that it can sort of be something that continues, and that there can be a farm after that and a farm after that, and that slowly and surely the community can secure, these valuable pieces of land that otherwise, unfortunately, when put on the private market, there's no responsibility for the person who purchases it to use it, right, as agricultural
Yep.
farmland and to tend it.
Yep.
So I think in that sense, it shows how the community land trust can enable communities to again empower themselves to say, what do we want the economic development of this place to be, and actually affect change.
Excellent. Now, I know when I was reading, when I was going through and reading a lot about the different organizations, there seemed to be a lot of organizations doing stuff around agriculture. Do you work together and collaborate? I mean, not that you all have slightly different missions, but I
Mhm.
presume there is overlap.
For sure.
I don't want to name names, but I just ones that I've actually, they're very intriguing. You have a lot going on, so I'm just wondering, is it a very collaborative, do you guys work together a lot on these
Yeah,
initiatives?
for sure.
Okay.
There's organizations that serve farmers in different ways, like helping them secure loans or grants from the state, for example. And the Berkshire Community Land Trust works in partnership with those kinds of organizations, and also conservation organizations. We most recently, the Berkshire Community Land Trust was awarded a grant from Massachusetts State to help further this River Run initiative. And that was an example of working with conservation organizations, actually some like birding groups, which they've got their strong representation in the
Yeah.
Berkshires. People love it's fascinating actually. It's a bird migration corridor, I learned.
I
This
didn't know
area,
that.
this area of Northeast, nor did I, nor would anyone if you don't live here. But there's many, yeah, species of birds that make their home or make their way through here. So in by being able to build those local partnerships with folks that, again, like I think what you're alluding to is in a really small community where these nonprofit initiatives are sometimes competing for the same funding, to be able to cooperate on an actual project and advance something. We're proud of the sort of way that the Berkshire Community Land Trust project shows that local collaboration and shows that, ecological objectives and economic objectives in terms of farmland preservation can work synergistically. Yeah.
Excellent. Jared, this has been a pleasure. I mean, I've learned so much. Is there anything that you want to get out there that we didn't talk about pertaining to any of these organizations and the missions?
Right. So what I haven't said that I say at this point is if you're interested in how you might replicate, either this local currency model or community land trust, the Schumacher Center website, which is centerforneweconomics.org. We have program pages for both of those types of work, and you can find essays from Bob, going back that sort of articulate the theory of change, and you'll also find practical information in terms of founding documents and lease agreements on the land side, or bylaws for Berkshires. Basically, just to say that the Center for New Economics shares freely all of this material because its role is educational. And so the idea is that we want to see these models taken up and replicated in every community. So go
I will
for it.
certainly get
And
that
yeah.
link. Absolutely. Thank you so much. This really has been very interesting. I learned so much. I hope our AgriTourist podcast prompts you to think more about where your food comes from, whether it be your vegetables, fruits, meats, and even those sweet treats. Don't forget to subscribe and share this podcast with someone you think may truly benefit from or be inspired by it. Visit us at agra-tourist.com. Until next time. As we are learning from many of our farmers and entrepreneurs, strong connections help propel our visions. Through my interview with Lisa Chase from the University of Vermont Extension and Vermont Tourism Research Center, I was connected to an exciting and new organization called the Global Agritourism Network, or GAN for short. The global network is made up of agritourism stakeholders from around the world. They include farmers and ranchers, researchers, educators, community planners, policymakers, agricultural service providers, and tour operators, among others. It is currently free to join, so if you have any interest in agritourism, check them out at agritourism.edu/GAN, or just Google Global Agritourism Network. The link will be in our show notes as well. You never know, this global network may help you take your agritourism vision to the next level.